Hi, welcome to lesson 4 of Generative AI for Beginners. My name is Nitya Narasimhan. I'm a senior cloud advocate on the AI advocacy team, and I'm excited to talk to you about prompt engineering fundamentals. So today, we're going to first start off with a quick recap. If you've been following the series, you know most of the terms. We'll just look at them really briefly. Then we'll talk about the 3 providers that you can use if you want to get started trying these out on your own. But most of this is going to focus on prompt engineering. You're going to learn what it is. You're going to learn why it matters. You're going to learn how to do prompt engineering. And then we leave you with a sense of intuition for how you can build your own mindset for prompt engineering in practice. So let's get started. A quick recap. If you've been following this course, these terms are probably familiar to you. What is a prompt? So we're talking generative AI, large language models. A prompt is just the natural language input, the text input that the user provides. And you can almost think of it as the way it programs the model to do what it wants, or the user programs the model to do what they want. So the response is then what the model does to kind of support the user request by generating content. Fabrication, you might have also heard of it by the term hallucination, is when sometimes the model generates a response that may not be rooted in fact, and we'll talk about that. A base LLM, or large language model, is really this foundational model that's trained on massive amounts of data. Think of it as a general purpose model that knows everything. But sometimes you want specialized models, things that know how to do a task very well. And that's what you look at for instruction-tuned LLMs, things that are good at summarization or translation or code generation. So what is prompt engineering? Prompt engineering is really this process where you iterate on the prompt, the text input that you give to the model, study the response, and keep going till the response looks like what you want it to be. To understand that, you need to understand how it works. So let's take a look at how the model works. Chat completion is this very basic thing where you go to the model, that's you in the pink prompt, you give it your text input, and it gives you content. Done, right? But wait, what's prompt engineering? It turns out that there are a lot of little things you can tweak that will help the model tune the response that it provides you. So for instance, you could have prompt templates that the user's input is put into that provide additional context. You can look at the conversation history. You can do things like retrieval augmented generation and ground it in data. There are system contexts. There are model parameters. So with prompt engineering, we're really looking at how do we kind of like adjust all these variables so that you get the best response you can for the prompt. But before we get started and dive into the details, let's talk about your choices. Now, if you've been following the course, there's a Getting Started folder that'll tell you how to set yourself up with one of these providers. You can go with OpenAI or Hugging Face, or you can set up on Azure AI and use both models in there with Azure OpenAI or Azure AI Studio. Today, for the most part, we're going to use OpenAI because that's something that's really accessible to you. But you can check out the repo for notebooks to use the others. Once you picked your model, again, you have 2 choices for trying out exercises on your own. You can go with the no-code option where you don't need to know any code at all. You just go to the sandbox that they provide. Or you can use the notebooks that we've given you that are set up with your credentials, and then you can do interactively programming exercises to learn prompt engineering. Today, we're going to pick the no-code option. So now let's dive in. Are you ready? The first thing we need to understand is why prompt engineering? What's the motivation? Number one motivation is models are stochastic. What that means is if you ask the model, if you go to it and give it a text input, there's no guarantee it's going to give you the same response every time. There's no guarantee that the response is going to be correct. There's no guarantee that the response is what you thought it would be. Let's take a look at what that means. So what we're going to do is we're going to try out some of these exercises. First, I have some of these providers set up. So here is Hugging Face. We're actually going to use Hugging Chat, which is their open source chat implementation, which has a model built in. And right now we're using Microsoft 5.3. I also have it set up with OpenAI, their playground. And on the other hand, I have Azure OpenAI as well. So we're going to start by giving all of them the exact same prompt. Let's see what happens. So I'm going to go in here and ask, let's start with Hugging Face and say, hey, tell me about the element gallium. And you'll see that it's giving you a proper response. Tells you it's a chemical element. But look at what it's giving you. It's like a multi-paragraph response, right? So you go to this provider, this model, you get this response. What happens if I tried an OpenAI? Here I'm using GPT-3.5 Turbo, and you'll see that it's given me a response, and it's shorter, and it seems different, and it keeps going. Wow, okay, but they were not identical, correct? Let's try this with Azure OpenAI. And by now you know where we're going. So I'm going to say, tell me about the element gallium. And remember that Azure OpenAI is using OpenAI under the covers. You'd assume that it would look similar to the other one, but it's not exactly. And this is what we mean by stochastic, that the same request going to different providers, different models is going to generate different responses. But wait, you might tell yourself, okay, providers are different, but if I stick to the one provider and just do everything with them, that's not an issue, right? Okay, let's try it out and see. So I'm going to say, tell me about the element gallium. And first, let's look at the response with GPT-3.5 Turbo. And you can see that it's giving me a response which has 3 to 4 paragraphs. Now I'm going to cancel this response, switch this to use GPT-4 Turbo, same provider, right? Should look similar. Not exactly, right? You can see that the text is different. It's doing something different. You can see that it's actually giving you stuff in Markdown. I didn't say what I should do, but you can see the response is different. Same provider. But wait, it gets better. Let's try something different. We're going to go back to GPT-3.5 Turbo, but now I'm going to basically say, tell me about the element gallium, and let's just keep it short so you can see the difference in one sentence, right? Now, the reason I want to do this is I want to show you something really interesting. This sounds nice. I've already engineered my prompt to give it a shorter response. But if I submit this again, you'd think it should give me the same response, same model, same request. I haven't changed anything, but look, it's different. This is stochastic. This means that if I were to try to use the responses from this model for my actual application, I have no guarantee I'm going to get the same thing multiple times. But want to see something fun? It gets worse. See this thing called temperature? If I change this and say, hey, get more creative, the bigger I make it, now, when I tell it the same thing, it gives me something completely different. It tells me everyday electronics to medical imaging. I don't even know if it's true, but it tells me something different. So you can see that by changing the parameters, changing the model, changing the text, we can actually get different responses. And that is challenge number 1. All right, let's look at what else we can do. We've tried all these. Oh yes, system persona, I forgot that one. That's a fun one. So here, by default, the system persona says you're a helpful assistant. So let's say, tell me about gallium. And we already seen this, but now we'll make it fun. We'll tell the system, your persona is you are a cheerful or you're a creative assistant that only speaks in limerick. All right, let's see what happens. It gives you limericks. So now you see how you can change the quality of the response by trying to tune all these parameters. That's your first kind of like step into understanding the power of prompt engineering. But it also exposed you the challenge of stochastic responses. There's no determinism. You don't know what's happening. But there's a second challenge. Remember, we talked about fabrication. Models can fabricate responses. And because of how they work, you may not even know that what they're saying is not grounded in truth. Because remember, a model doesn't really understand, doesn't know the meaning of what you're asking it. It's just predicting tokens. It's predicting the next word based on its global knowledge. So it'll look realistic, but may not be true. Let's try it out and see. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at 2 different models in OpenAI. We're going to look at GPT-3.5 Turbo. Its cutoff date was September 2021. So it only knows about things prior to that date. GPT-4 Turbo has a September 2023 cutoff date, but it's also one of the more newer models. So it kind of has already been given a little extra sauce to make sure, it doesn't fabricate as much. So we're going to go to these models and ask them who won the 2025 Oscar for Best Picture. And yes, 2025 has not happened yet. So let's try it out and see what happens. So we're going to go in here. And we're going to first start by saying, and let's start with GPT-3.5 Turbo. And I'm just going to copy this in there. Oh, and let's reset this because I want this to go back to being just the default assistant. So now I'm saying who won this, and it's GPT-3.5 Turbo. And it doesn't tell you that it doesn't know it's not fabricated. It just says, I can't tell you real-time information, which itself is weird because 2025 is not real time. But hey, that's okay. Let's see what happens when I go to GPT-4 Turbo, which is a newer model. I give it the same thing. But what this is doing is telling you, hey, I don't have information because you're giving me a date that doesn't exist. So this is actually a little bit smarter. But now let's go back and try something interesting. Remember that GPT-3.5 Turbo told me that, hey, I can't tell you because it's real-time information. Let's try changing it just slightly, right? We're asking the same question, but we're going to change it slightly. And instead of saying who won it, say, tell me the premise for the movie that won the Oscar. We're saying it won. Tell me what it was. Let's see what happens. Do you see what's happening? It made up a movie. It even told me what it did. This is fabrication. There's no way this movie exists because 2025 hasn't happened yet, but it did it. This is fabrication. Now, let's see what happens if we ask GPT-4.5 Turbo, which is the newer model, right? Or GPT-4 Turbo. This one is smarter. It's going to come and say, I can't deal with 2025. It hasn't happened yet, right? So this is a fair one. And just kind of like, make sure we are not doing the wrong thing. We can try to have it tell us about the 2015 big Oscar, which did happen. And sure enough, it gives you the right response. Both of them will do. So here I can go ahead and do this with GPT-3.5 Turbo, and this will get it right as well. So what did we learn? We've learned that the prompt engineering model has an issue with stochastic responses and with fabrication. And prompt engineering is what we need to do to improve the quality of that response. So now let's dive into how we can do that. So over here, we're going to look at the first and more, the kind of like the high level principle, which is start by giving your model clear instructions. We're going to go through a bunch of demos here, back to back. First, we'll start with the basic prompt, just let it complete it. Then we'll iterate on it with conversation. Then we'll instruct it. We'll kind of make it clearer by giving it specific instructions it should do, refine it for the specificities of the task, the format, the length. Then we'll try doing something called primary content to see if we can stop the fabrication or ground it in real data, look at cues, and finally look at something interesting called few-shot prompting or providing examples. Let's get started. So here, I'm going to go back to the the OpenAI model. We'll stick with GPT-3.5 Turbo. Everything reset back to like the default assistant message. We'll start with our basic prompt. So I'm just going to go in, and I want to just show you what prompt completion looks like. So what I'm going to say is and this is how you know that it really doesn't understand context. I'm just giving it, oh, say, can you see? Let's see what it does. It comes back to you with by the dawn's early light. It's literally just completing it. So this is a basic prompt that does completion, right? No context. I didn't give it a task. It just predicted the next things. And lo and behold, anything starts with that is likely to be the national anthem. Now let's try a complex prompt. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this now and say, okay, let's go back to our gallium. And I'm going to say, hey, what is gallium? And it comes back to me and tells me, hey, this is this element in the periodic table. But now I can get into a conversation, right? So I can actually say, and this is where it gets interesting, I can say what follows it. I didn't give the name. I just said what follows it. And it automatically connects the context to what I asked before. So this is one of the first techniques in prompt engineering, that we can refine the response by getting into a conversation where we're interactively trying to get it to improve on the response from before. But wait, now we want to talk about using instructions. We were just looking at basic prompts and how you can do complex multi-turn conversations. Now let's get serious. So let's assume that I'm a middle school teacher and I have to do a lesson plan for my kids on the Civil War. So I go over here and I say, hey, I need to kind of have something I can put on a slide that helps them understand the Civil War. So I go over there and I say, hey, write me a short essay on the Civil War. And you can see it's writing me this really long essay. And this is great. I don't know how much of it is true, but that's a lot. I don't know. I mean, like, I couldn't read this in class. So I'm like, I actually need to get more specific. So the first thing for prompt engineering when you want a better response is you try to make it more specific. So what we're going to go in here, and we're going to basically, let me get rid of this one. And I'm also going to change the maximum length to something smaller so we're not being overwhelmed. And what we're going to do is we say, write a short essay on the Civil War, but I'm going to give you more instructions. Provide key dates for the events. Tell me the significance. Identify key figures and their contributions. Because this is what I want to teach my students, right? And if you try this, now you can see that it is actually beginning to answer according to the things that I asked, right? So it's telling me the events, it's telling me the issues. And by the way, if I continue this on, key figures, and that's because I'd set this minimum length to 192. So the first response came back with that many characters, and then I had to hit it again for it to continue on, right? But you can see it's answered my questions. But this is still a little too much, right? I want to kind of make it a little bit better because this is not, my students are not going to read all this stuff. So what can I do? Let's try to improve it by now defining the length and format. So I'm going to take the same thing, and we're going to try to improve the prompt. And this is literally what prompt engineering is. You keep iterating. Now I'm saying, provide a list of dates, etc. But now give it to me in Markdown. And 2 paragraphs, that's all I want. 2 paragraphs, and give it to me in Markdown. Notice how it's formatting it for me in Markdown. It's giving me 2 sections. It's giving me a bulleted list with the dates. I can now copy this into a web page or into a slide, and it's clear, concise, and better. Much better, right? But now let's talk about, remember we said fabrication? How can I potentially try to reduce the amount of fabrication this could have? So to try this out, first I'm going to take a question from the Civil War. And I'm going to say, okay, let's ask this question. Who fired on Fort Sumter? And it gives me this information. And I don't know if this is right or wrong, but more importantly, let's say I asked my students to read a particular paragraph and come back to me with a relevant response. I can check if this is what's in there. Now we're going to talk about this thing called primary content, where now you can actually provide an instruction where you give it the grounding context. So I can actually put down, and this paragraph is actually from Wikipedia. So I can put down this, the content, the primary content that is relevant to this particular question. And then I ask the question. I'm like, okay, who fired on Fort Sumter? And if you look into this, the answer is actually in this, right? So Confederate troops fired on Fort Sumter. And if I hit an enter, it tells me exactly what's in there. And the interesting thing is, if I hit enter again and again, you'll notice that the response remains consistent. It's no longer as stochastic as it used to be, because now I've literally given it the context, the primary content on which that question should be asked. Much better, right? What else can we do? Well, let's say, for example, this particular teacher not only wants to get the answer, but wants to get the answer to be phrased in a certain way. This is where you can use something called cues. So what happens with cues is if you ask a question or you tell it to give it an instruction, you can kind of, it's like a cold start, you can nudge it in the direction you want it to go. So let's try this out. I'm going to start with a simple instruction. Tell me about 5 popular fruits. And it comes back to me with a whole bunch of information, right? And I'm like, that's not what I wanted. I wanted it to tell me something, and I want it to be in alphabetical order. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this and say, okay, tell me about this. And then I'm going to hit this, and I'm going to queue it up. I'm going to queue up the response. I'm going to say, tell me about 5 popular fruits, and then say the 5 popular fruits in reverse alphabetical order are, and if I did this right, it gives me the same fruits, and they're in reverse alphabetical order. I kind of seeded it. I nudged it in the direction I wanted it to go. But wait, it gets better. I'm looking at this going, this is not what I want. I want those kids to remember it. So I want to kind of give it some examples of how I want this to, how I want the response to be done, right? And so we can do this. And this is called, first we're going to talk about zero-shot prompting and few-shot prompting. So here, I'm basically going to start with zero-shot prompting, where I'm saying I haven't told you anything. I'm just giving you an example. And I'm going to see what it does. And you'll see that it continues on and tries to describe this fruit. So it didn't learn anything. It's just like continuing on. And I get a decent response. But it's not what I wanted. What if I went in and instead said, hey, what I really want is for you to talk about fruit, but I want you to make it into this kind of like this. Hey, these are maybe elementary school kids. So I'm like, A is for apple, a fruit, that's sweet. Now let's see what happens when I hit an enter here. Do you see? It not only was able to look at the pattern and see, hey, there are 2 at a time, but it figured out that they were alphabetical. I didn't tell it. It figured it out that they're alphabetical. And this is the most interesting. It figured out that they rhymed. Sweet and treat, red and spread, indeed and freed. You see that? So this is where you can effectively tell it examples of what you want to see, and it tries to learn from them, not learn from them, sees the pattern, if you will, and tries to use that pattern to give you a better response. So all of these are techniques you can use for prompt engineering. And with that, let's kind of get back to our slides and wrap up what we were talking about. We talked about clear instructions. You want to try this out, go try out the assignment that's in the lesson. And you can do that with a code-first approach by putting in your credentials. Once you've got that, what can you do next? As you notice, the best way for prompt engineering, you have to iterate, iterate, iterate. So you can do things like change the persona, change the parameters, add examples, understand limitations. And when you're done, when you've got it to the point where it looks good, create a template. So that next time you don't need to go through the exercise again, you know exactly the prompt that you need to ask, put it in there, share it with all the other teachers so they can use it too. And this is exactly what we do when we think about prompt template library. So I encourage you to go look at this site as an example of how you would build a prompt template library for your application. This is Prompts for EDU. But you might be telling yourself, well, not education. I want to know how to write prompts for something else, for retail, for gaming. I don't know. This is where I encourage you to go look at the provider sites. OpenAI has a prompt examples collection. So you can go look at what a good prompt looks like, how to set system context parameters, etc. Hugging Chat will let you pick any model and then literally give it an example that you can see how it works on it. And Azure AI has a prompt catalog. So you've got a good place to start from. And with that, we come to the end of lesson 4. So to recap, if you are interested in what we were doing today, we learned core concepts. We understood the challenges of generative AI today in terms of prompt usage. We figured out what are the different techniques for prompt engineering. And we looked at ways in which you can go and build your intuition by using templates and examples from other providers. We can't wait to see what generative AI applications you build. See you in the next lesson.